Alrighty, I think we've had a fair few people filter in. So good afternoon and welcome to the AgriFutures Chicken Meat Program webinar series. To those of you who are new here, welcome, and to those returning to the series, welcome back. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to past, present and future elders of these nations and any First Nations people on this webinar today. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people of Australia, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where I am hosting this webinar from today. So I'll firstly roll into a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording today's session and making that available through online channels. As I run through the rest of this housekeeping items, there will be an introductory poll that pops up on your screen with some questions for us to gauge who's in the virtual room with us, and we'd be grateful for your responses to those. As this is a webinar format, your video and audio function will not be enabled, and that's just so that it allows us to minimize any background noise and distractions to our speaker. We will have time for questions and answers at the conclusion of today's webinar content. There is a dedicated Q&A chat function which you can use to pop in any questions that you have over the course of this webinar. It is located, or if you hover over your screen, it is located across the bottom bar and is close by to the chat function, but not to be confused because we will be monitoring the Q&A function rather than the chat. So a quick introduction to myself. I'm Sarika Pandya, a research manager, part of the broader AgriFutures Levied and Emerging Industries team, and I specifically look after the chicken meat research, development and extension, hereafter shortened to RD&E program. Now, one of the key research priorities within this within the program, it focuses on improving environmental sustainability outcomes, and the program invests in research and projects via industry levies within this area to improve knowledge on the most significant components of the chicken meat industry's environmental impacts. Now, this webinar is the fourth in a series in which we host expert presenters to provide you with the latest information on topics that are relevant to the industry as well as our research priorities. Now, today's webinar is all about litter management, and as we enter into the warmer months, or for some states have already entered into the warmer months of the years, adjusting in-shed practices to maintain optimal living conditions to help maintain health and productivity of chickens requires active management, and this webinar will focus on aspects of litter management as well as tips that are pertinent to the warmer months of the year. Now, I hope you enjoy today's content. For anybody that joined last time for our last webinar about the sustainability framework, it wasn't fully smooth sailing, but we hope today's one will be just as entertaining and informative. So our speaker for today is Mark Dunlop, and I'll provide you all a bit of an introduction about Mark. Whilst I do so, Mark, now is the time to start sharing your presentation. So Mark is the Principal Environmental Researcher from the Queensland Department of Agriculture, not AgriFutures and Fisheries, Agriculture and Fisheries, and has worked with DAF Queensland for over 20 years. He's led RD&E in areas of litter management, litter amendments, energy efficiency, animal welfare, odour and environmental impacts. Mark is currently a program leader within the AgriFutures Chicken Meat, Gut Health and Environment project, also known as the Consortium, and in addition to that has completed several projects with the AgriFutures Chicken Meat program outside of that consortium. So without further ado, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Sarika. That was a very nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be able to have a chat with you today. I don't think there's too much of a reason to delay, so I'll just make a start here, I guess. So I'm going to be talking again today about litter management and with a bit of a summer focus, I guess. To start with, I just want to acknowledge AgriFutures for their funding of the research that we do and the support from the Queensland Government through the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Particularly, I'd like to thank all the growers and integrators who have always contributed to the research that we do. We can't do the research and we can't present it to you without your assistance. So thank you very much for providing your farms, your data, and for giving your time and sharing your thoughts with me. It's been fantastic. So heading into summer, I think it's a good time to do a number of checks with the farm, with the shed, ventilation system and drinkers. And these things are all important for litter management, but also for helping to keep the chickens cool as well when you're dealing with hot days. Some of us, I think, have already experienced some quite hot days, so it might have been a bit of an early introduction to summer. Keeping litter dry and friable, of course, relies on getting everything right, starting to manage the litter and getting it ready before the birds and the litter have even arrived, getting your shed ready, having your drinkers set up right, ensuring that the ventilation system's working well, and then once the birds arrive, doing whatever you need to keep the litter friable. Hopefully you've got good feed so that the chickens are healthy and happy. But there's some things that I guess that are a little bit more difficult to manage than others. So some things you don't really have much control over. So we'll try and focus on some of the things you do. I've presented this bit of information a number of times already. So the chickens are the main source of water to the litter. They can add up to about 2 litres of water per square metre per day. So in many of your sheds, which are probably 1,500 to 2,500 square metres, you're looking at 3,000 to 5,000 litres of water per day that needs to be removed from the shed at the peak of the amount of water going on. The amount of water that they put on, you can't do a lot about. So one thing you can do is to focus on reducing excess water that isn't necessary to be going into the litter. And now's a good time to check the flow rates of drinkers to make sure that they're not too high. You don't want to restrict how much water the birds are able to get, because otherwise that can affect their growth rates. But if you've got excess amount of water, it just ends up on the litter. So the recommendations for the breeds that most of you will be growing is to have a maximum of about 90 to 100 mils per minute flow rate of water coming out through the nipples. Hopefully most of you have access to a way to measure this. If not, I guess get in touch with me and we'll see what we can organise for you. Looking at the litter conditions is really an important part of this process. You can't just measure the flow rate because it isn't necessarily the most accurate way to know how much water the birds are actually getting, or how much water is spilling on the floor. So have a look at the litter conditions under the drinkers. If you're always getting quite wet litter under the drinkers, then chances are you can reduce the pressure and reduce the flow rate through them. But if the litter's quite dry underneath your drinkers, then you probably don't want to be making any changes regardless of what you measure with the flow meter. So it needs to be a bit of a balanced approach, looking at both measuring the flow, but also looking at the litter, and then also keeping an eye on your growth rates of your birds as well. The fans are the next important part of this whole process with ventilation, because they're the driving force for getting fresh air into the shed and for extracting the moisture and the stale air out of the shed. And one of the easiest tools and probably the best ways that I know to measure how well the fans are working is to use a tachometer. These devices can be quite cheap. If you look on eBay, you'll pick one up for $20 or $30. And in my experience, the cheap ones are just as good, if not better, than the quite expensive ones. So if you don't have one of these, I think it's a great investment to get one. What these things do is they have a little, looks like a red light coming out the end of it. You stand on the inside of your shed, you point it out through the fan while it's running, and it counts the number of blades. So it can give you an idea about how fast the fan is turning, so that you can work out the RPM, or revolutions per minute. And a couple of things that you can look for with this device is to compare your fan speeds, fan to fan to fan. Most of you would have the same fans in the shed, or most, the tunnel fans are usually all the same type, so they should all be spinning at the same speed. So what you can do is quickly go along. It only takes a few seconds per fan to measure it, and you can do them while they're all running. And it helps you to identify fans that might be running slower than the other ones. And then from there, you can start looking at the reasons why. The other thing it lets you do is measure the fan's maximum RPM. So when it's running, you'll need to get hold of what the manufacturer says it should be doing. So you can get back onto your equipment suppliers, your fan supplier, to get that information. But from that, you can actually make sure that all of your fans are running at the right speed, so that you know that you're getting the right airflow. Over time, the pulleys can wear and the belts can wear, and the fan might turn slower. And so where you might be expecting to get your 3 or 3.5 or 4 meter per second airspeed at full tunnel on a hot day, if your fans aren't working at their full speed, you won't get the right flow rate and you won't be getting the same amount of cooling. So this is a cheap tool that lets you check a lot of things with the fans. In the past, I guess we've always focused on the belt-driven fans, but I think checking the revs, the RPM of your direct drive and variable speed fans is also important. While the direct drive fans don't have belts that can wear, the speed is controlled by a voltage signal. And if there's any kind of loose connections, corrosion, broken or damaged wires, you might be getting a lower voltage through that signal wire than what you're expecting. And it may cause one or more of the fans to run slower than what you're expecting. So to use one of these things, which only takes a few seconds to go across and check your fans, I think it's just a good double check to make sure that everything's working the way it should. If you do still have belts, see if you can get your hands on some of these belt and sheave gauges or belt and pulley gauges. And what these help you to do is work out whether it's your belts that's worn out or the pulleys that's worn out. With the diagram, shown with the sketch here, you can see there's a bit of an opening around the side of the gauge. That's showing wear of the pulley. And so you can put a new belt onto this pulley and it's going to work well for about 5 minutes until it basically puts extra pressure on a certain part of the belt. It'll wear in very quickly, and then most of your performance gain will be lost. So this will help you identify that pulley needs to be replaced. Other ways that you can check your belts and pulleys is to have a look at how low the belt is sitting in the pulley. And there's no golden rule to this. If you've got new belts and new pulleys on any of your fans, pay attention to where the belt sits on them, and then that'll tell you where it should be sitting. In this example here, we've got a belt pulley with 2 belts on it. You can see that one's sitting lower than the other. So straight away, you know that one of that either that belt or that side of the pulley is worn out more than the other side. Having the sheave gauges will help you work out whether it's the belts or the pulleys, but making sure. But what you can do is you can actually walk along all of your fans and you can see how low the belt is sitting in the pulleys, and that can help work out some fans that may need some attention or checking. And if you happen to have a thermal camera, another thing you can do is sort of look at the temperature of the pulleys on all of the belt motors, on all of the fan motors and the fans, and look for them getting hotter. If the belt is slipping, the pulley will get hot. And you can quite easily pick this up at times. I wouldn't go buying a thermal camera just for this, but it is a useful tool if you've already got one. It's another way that you can check how well your fans are working. And while you're looking at your fans, of course, make sure that the grills are clean and that all the shutters are working smoothly. Because if they're not opening up fully or they're not shutting properly, then it's going to create issues with the rest of the ventilation system. It's really important to have an airtight shed. If you've got air leaking in through places that you don't want it, then you have less air coming in through the mini vents and through the cool pads than what you're expecting it to have. So if you're going to be calling on your tunnel ventilation and your cool pads to bring in cool air into the shed, and you've got mini vents that aren't closing properly, then you're going to be bringing in hot air through the mini vents, and you're not going to be getting the full cooling effect that you expect. A really good way to check the leakage or the air tightness of your shed is to do a pressure test with it. University of Georgia have developed an app which I think is really useful, and it's free. You can download it from the App Store or the Google Play Store. It allows you to put in the details of your own farm, so your shed length and width. You put in your fan air flow rate, and then you measure the static air pressure, and it gives you an estimate of how leaky your shed is. With the static pressure, you could either measure it with your controller, but ideally, if you have your own static pressure meter, like the one that's shown here, then you can be checking your pressure gauge in your controller as well as the pressure that you achieve in your house, in the shed. And there's information that University of Georgia have on this in their poultry ventilation tips. And there's a link there or you can get onto me if you want more information about it. Relative humidity is a really important parameter that probably doesn't get looked at closely enough. Everyone knows the temperatures that you're trying to achieve, but the humidity will affect how the bird feels at those temperatures. One recommendation is to keep your relative humidity below 60% as much as you can. This is important because you need to have lower humidity to be able to draw the water out of the litter. And it also helps the birds to feel cooler. When that humidity is higher, the birds will feel hotter and will be hotter. Ideally, if you've got humidity sensors installed in your shed, have a look at the data every day. And if you see that your relative humidity is creeping up every day, then it's a good chance that there's a good sign that your litter is actually getting wetter and you need to change your ventilation, probably by increasing it a bit. If you don't have humidity and sensors installed in the shed, then you might be able to use a handheld meter like the Kestrel that I'm showing here, and just measure the humidity in the shed at the same time every day. In the morning tends to be a good time. And if you see that it's increasing every day, then once again, it's a sign that the litter's probably getting wetter and you need to increase your ventilation. If the relative humidity is higher than about 75 or 80%, then you can just about guarantee that your litter is going to be getting wetter. You're going to get more caking, you're going to have more ammonia, and then you're going to have to spend more time tilling the litter and then paying for gas to heat it and more ventilation to try and dry that litter out again. So if you can catch the humidity as it's increasing and try and keep it below 60%, then that's a much better way. It's a lot easier for you in the long run. So how can you go about trying to keep the humidity below 60%? Well, the main tool, I think, is increasing ventilation. So increase it a little bit, and hopefully you'll start to see the humidity in the shed start to drop. In summer, using the cool pads is always nearly a necessity in most places. But one of the problems with cool pads is that it increases the humidity in the shed. So one of the ways to keep the humidity down is to try and reduce how much you use the cool pads as much as you can. One of the recommendations is to try and not use your cool pads below 29.5 degrees. And certainly don't use them when the relative humidity outside is above 80%. If the humidity is above 80%, then a couple of things will happen. One, all you're going to be doing is bringing in that's already humid air, making it even more humid when it's in the shed, because it's going to add more moisture to it. But you're going to get minimal cooling anyway. And so there's not a lot of benefit to doing it. Increasing and making sure you're at the maximum tunnel ventilation first is far more important, because it's actually going to be removing the heat energy that the birds are producing and remove it from the shed. And another sort of rule of thumb is to not use your evaporative cooling between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. So don't use it at night. And most of the time, that's just because the relative humidity outside will be higher than the 80% anyway. To reduce relative humidity, you can increase the heat. And that may be an option that you have with at any one time. And just remember the rule of thumb that increasing the air temperature by 10 degrees Celsius reduces the relative humidity by about half. So if you can increase the air temperature, particularly the air that's going to the floor, then you'll actually be reducing its humidity and give it more chance to remove moisture from the litter. Another thing to consider is sustaining your ventilation longer into the evening. So in summer, we've got warmer afternoons, warmer evenings. It's usually not too bad to be trying to increase your ventilation for longer into the evening. There's a couple of good reasons to do that. One, it keeps the ventilation up in the shed and will remove more water from the shed every day. So you'll have dry litter. Normally, most of the evaporation rate in the shed, most of the water will be evaporated from the litter between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. In summer, that goes quite a bit later because of the warm weather that we have. So try and take advantage of that by keeping the ventilation rate up. In summer, of course, we have hotter days, so it stores more heat energy in the shed as well. So everything warms up in the shed. The litter will be warmer, the walls will be warmer, the roof will be warmer. You store a lot more heat energy in the shed. If your ventilation starts to reduce too early, that heat remains in the shed. And one thing that I've noticed when I've looked at fan activity data in the past is you see the fans sort of in the evening that they'll turn down, and then you'll see them ramp up again, and then they'll reduce again, then they'll ramp up again, then they'll reduce again. And that's a good sign that the heat energy stored in that shed has not been removed yet and needs to be removed. So every time the ventilation shuts down, all that heat energy is released from the floor and from the walls back into the shed, and then the shed gets hot again. And then it triggers the ventilation system to run faster again. And then, of course, you bring in cool air from outside, then it gets cold, and you just have this wave of ventilation increasing and decreasing. It's much better just to keep that ventilation up for longer until all that heat is being taken out of the shed. It's also been shown to reduce the heat stress felt by the birds when you go into the dark period at night, because they sit down and they sit on the litter. The hotter that litter is, the more heat stress the birds will actually feel. So if you can keep the ventilation running for longer into the evening and get more of that heat out, get the litter cooler, it will reduce the amount of heat stress that the birds feel. Air movement's really important because it gets the air down to the litter, which gets the air going around the birds, which is good for their cooling, but it also gets it to the litter surface, which is good for removing moisture from the litter. Another reason, or another thing to think about with keeping the ventilation going into the evening is on days when you might be tilling the litter. This is one thing that we measured in our last project, where the ammonia concentration in the shed, there were several times where it actually increased into the evening. So looking at this graph here, that black line is the time where the litter was tilled, so it was about 11:30 in the morning, and the ammonia level decreased in the afternoon because it was being ventilated out of the shed. Around looks like about 5 o'clock, the ventilation started to reduce. This is probably in winter. And then all of a sudden the ammonia started to creep up again, and it stayed high throughout the whole night and into the next day. So from this, I think you just need to increase or be aware that the ammonia will still be coming out of the litter more than what it was before tilling. And it's really important to keep the ventilation up as high as you can for as long as you can after tilling to try and remove it. The more you can ventilate, the more moisture you'll get out of the litter, so the drier it will be, and dry litter produces less ammonia. And you'll also be removing ammonia with that moisture as well. So after tilling, definitely ventilate as much as you can and then into the evening, consider keeping the ventilation higher if the weather's suitable for it. So one thing that we've also measured is the amount of water that's removed after tilling. So tilling the litter will open up the litter, will reduce its compaction, will make it less compacted, and this releases a lot of water. So for the first 4 to 6 hours after tilling, there's a window where you're going to be removing about 4 to 5 times as much water per hour from that litter. So you can really accelerate its drying. But then going on into the evening for the 12 to 15 hours after tilling, so that's pretty much the whole evening after tilling, you're still going to have more water being released from the litter. So if you don't have higher ventilation, one, it's going to increase the humidity in the shed, but two, there's going to be ammonia in that water as well. And this is probably one of the mechanisms that's actually increasing the ammonia in the shed for the night after tilling. So it's a really good indication. All these things kind of fit together. So yeah, the recommendation that we would have is to try and ventilate as much as you can after tilling, because dry litter will reduce the relative humidity in the shed, and will reduce the amount of ammonia and odor that it releases as well. Another way to manage relative humidity in the shed is to be using the shed the way it's designed. Most people have their shed set up this way. So you're trying to bring in fresh air through the mini vents, get it to warm up with heat that's stored in the ceiling, so that it's warmer by the time it gets to the litter. And this is important because it increases the ability for that air to remove moisture from the litter. It also helps to shift basically the cold air that will be sitting down on the litter, and cold air is going to be more humid. And then pick that moisture up out of the floor and then ventilate it out of the shed with the exhaust fans. But all of this depends on the fans running all the time. In summer, that may be the case, except for when the birds are very, very young. But this is something probably it's more of a winter issue. And you know, if you're considering circulation fans, then maybe now's the time to start planning for it so you can be ready for next winter. But I guess what I'm working towards here is the necessity for keeping air moving in the shed all of the time. Whenever the air stops, you will find that the hot air will rise back up into the roof, where it's no use to you. You can't be using it to remove water from the litter, and it's just trapped. To get these air currents right, everything needs to be right. You need to have your side vents adjusted properly. You need to have the right static pressure in the shed. And this is where having fans that are working properly and having an airtight shed, so without leakage, are just very important. If any of these things aren't perfect, then the air currents that you'll get with your ventilation system will break down. You won't actually get the air movement that you're expecting and the air movement that you need. And then any time that the fans turn off, all of that air movement stops. And what I've seen doing some smoke tests in sheds is that when the fans are cycling on and off, the air sometimes barely even makes it down to the floor. It just sort of goes up into the roof apex, starts making its way down, the fan turns off and everything stops moving. And so this really doesn't function well, and it really contributes to the litter getting wetter because you can't be removing the water from it if the air's not getting down there. And the other thing too that I think happens is that you get the cold air settling on the floor, and then of course it's more humid, so then you get more condensation. The whole system really sort of breaks down. Having air movement is just so important. When we look in a shed, so this is clearly an older shed, the air temperature will vary from the floor to the ceiling. And so what we see here in this example is that the floor's a nice brooding temperature of 32 to 34 degrees, and then it goes warmer until you've got quite hot air, 36 to 38 degrees sitting against the ceiling. So with that hot air against the ceiling, you'll have more of it escaping through the ceiling because no insulation is perfect. So you're going to be losing the heat energy that you've paid for with heating. But it's also not coming down to the floor where it's going to be able to remove the water from the floor. So what we're sort of working towards here is having more air movement that will actually bring that heat down and get it back down to the floor. And another important thing to consider is what temperatures are your sensors in your shed, your temperature sensors that you use to know what the conditions are like in your shed. What are they actually measuring? Whenever your heaters turn on, all that hot air goes up to the ceiling. And then what you find is that it's got to heat all the ceiling all the way down to the sensor. And then the sensor will take a minute or two for it to actually register that temperature, and then your heaters turn off. By having constant air movement, it will actually create more uniform conditions from the floor to the ceiling. Your sensors will know what the temperature is more quickly, and then the shed can adjust and maintain a more uniform condition rather than cycling through heating and ventilating. So circulation fans, in a survey that we did a couple of years ago now, about a quarter of the growers in Australia already had some form of stirring fan or circulation fan in their sheds, which is great to hear. So I mean, I've already gone through many of these advantages. So having the circulation fans, brings down the heat, prevents cold air from settling on the floor, and improves the temperature uniformity. And many growers have told us too that it's been reducing their heating costs. So when they've installed the circulation fans, it's actually reduced their heating costs. And that's one of the paybacks for paying for the electricity to run them. There's different styles of circulation fans. So there's ones that you could call would be a zone stirring fan. So they only really move the air around the fan itself. And then you've got whole shed circulation. So using a system of fans to move all of the air around all of the shed. And that's a system that's been developed and being tested by the University of Georgia, and they're still working on and developing. But there's information, they've got some evidence to show that it really helps to keep the litter drier or prevents the wet litter from occurring. Because that's one of the things with wet litter. When you're looking at the evaporation rate, so that's the amount of water that can be removed every hour, you can remove more water from wet litter than you can from dry litter because the water is more available to be removed. And so by having circulation fans that create a bit of airspeed over the litter, you actually accelerate that drying rate, but you're really accelerating it on the wet litter, not so much on the dry litter. And so what that does is it helps to reduce the occurrence of the really wet litter that can be in the shed, and you get more uniform litter conditions. One thing that I think is important to mention with circulation fans is the need to run them constantly, unless they're interfering with something else that's in your shed. So if you have the circulation fans turning off for any period of time, what you find is that the hot air will go straight up to the ceiling. This will happen in a very short amount of time, probably less than a few minutes, and the cold air will settle on the floor again. And when you turn the circulation fans on, if you use smoke, one thing that you notice is that it doesn't come all the way down to the floor straight away. It'll kind of half come down and go back up into the ceiling because it's still hot and it's got that buoyancy force that wants to drive it back up into the ceiling. It takes a while. From stuff that I've done with some smoke, it probably takes 10 or 15 minutes to actually get that uniform temperature again so that the air can move around because of the circulation fan, the way that you're expecting it to. So I think it's probably a false economy to be turning the fans off for short periods of time if they can be left running. Of course, once you get enough of your ventilation fans running that you've got constant air movement, then you turn your circulation fans off. But any time that you cut back to fans cycling on and off, the circulation fans definitely need to be running, and you run them constantly. So I think in general, the best types of air circulation systems are ones that create uniform conditions throughout the shed. So rather than zone circulation fans, it's better to have a system of them that will mix and move the air throughout the entire shed, to move the air to the end walls and to mix it from floor to ceiling so that you get uniform conditions everywhere. And having that air moving, having that uniform condition will help the temperature sensors in the shed to understand what the conditions are in the shed, rather than just measuring in a point, which will be somewhere between, like the hot ceiling and the cold floor. And using the circulation fans in a way that work with your mini vents and the heaters, and work with the other currents in your shed is obviously important as well, so that they're not fighting each other. So that's nearly it from me. So just wrapping up, I think summer's a great time to do some of the checks on your drinkers, to check the flow rates, to check your fans, measure the RPM, make sure your shutters and grills are clean and working the way they should, and measure the wear on your belts. In your shed, do a pressure test using that app from the University of Georgia, and adjust your mini vents so that they're all closing off when they need to be closed, and that they're opening up to the right angle so that you get the right airflow through them. Because of the warmer weather that we get in summer, try and take advantage of it and run your ventilation more into the evening to try and remove more water from the shed, and also try and remove that extra heat that would have gone into the litter during the day and into the walls of the shed and everywhere else. And just remember that if you've tilled on that day, definitely ventilate more for that evening and keep an eye on it for the next day. And doing whatever you can to increase air movement, whether it's with air circulation fans, or if you've only got your ventilation fans to work with, make sure that your mini vents are adjusted right, and take steps just to try and get as much air moving around your shed and mixing that air up as best you can. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time. I'll just pass you back over to Sarika. And before I wrap up, I suppose we've got a lot of this information on a website called Litterpedia, so you can click on the link or copy down the link that we've got here. I think we're going to put it into the Q&A or the chat section. Or if you've got your phone, you can take a picture of this QR code. Or if you want to, get in touch with me and I'll help you to find it. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Fabulous. Look, thank you very much, Mark. There was a lot of information in that presentation, but particularly a lot of practical tips which hopefully either shared or brought to light any new information for our audience, or refreshed or reaffirmed any sort of any management practice known to our audience. So just a reminder that to everybody on this webinar that Mark is a great source of knowledge. So if you've got any questions, feel free to please pop them into the chat. I know the program did actually receive a couple of questions via email prior to the webinar, which, look, I believe they have been answered throughout your presentation, Mark. But what I'll do is I'll just re-ask those questions here, just in case there's any grabs or any highlight information that you want to highlight in response to those two questions. So that will just give our audience an opportunity, if they've got any other questions, to populate the Q&A section with them. So the first question is, with moisture control and ventilation management both being important areas in litter management, are there any balancing strategy or strategies that you'd recommend in maintaining good litter quality with reasonable moisture level in shed management?
That's a really difficult question to answer, but I guess the tools that most growers have these days that can help to balance out the moisture and the litter conditions is the litter tilling, and then in low ventilation conditions, installing circulation fans would certainly help. The air movement will help to remove more water from the wet litter without excessively drying the dry litter. And then having the tilling mixes the wet and the dry. So it's a good way to mix the like to balance out the litter conditions, and particularly try and address the wet litter, which is probably the higher risk litter when it comes to foot-pad dermatitis and ammonia production. So I think they're probably the best two strategies that we've got at the moment.
Fantastic. And then the second question received was is around innovative approaches and technologies. So given the importance of air circulation and ventilation management, have you seen or can you suggest any innovative approaches, technologies? I don't know, there were some things mentioned in your presentation that can help optimize shed climate in regions or periods of time where there's extreme temperature fluctuations or there's fluctuations between during the day and the night during summer.
Yeah, again, another difficult question. This is something that I've had a number of growers talk to me over the years, and it's particularly challenging when you get the big changes in temperature during the days between day and night, or I've had growers say that, you know, when a summer storm rolls through, you can have a 10 or 15 degree temperature drop over a very short period of time, and that can put the shed into absolute chaos with the ventilation system. And there's not too many things that can really address that because you have to have the shed open to the outside world. It's really, I guess, making sure that all of the things that you can have right are as right as you can. So making sure the insulation in your shed's up to scratch so that it retains or buffers the temperature changes. At low ventilation, while the shed's probably closed up a fair bit anyway. So, but adding circulation fans would certainly help with keeping more uniform conditions throughout the shed. But no, I'm not aware of any particular technologies or approaches to address having to deal with massive temperature swings day to day, unfortunately.
No, I appreciate you sort of providing that guidance and advice on those questions, and I'm fairly certain the asker of those questions was able to join us for the webinar. So I hope those responses did answer your questions. If not, feel free to reach out to the program, or if you managed to grab Mark's details, to reach out to Mark directly if you wanted to discuss anything further. And whilst we've been going through that, we've got one question, we've received one question in the Q&A section. So Mark, any antimicrobials that you can recommend to check pathogens in litter?
No recommendations. I don't think antimicrobials are widely used in the litter that we have in Australia. There is information from previous AgriFutures projects that I can share with you about the litter amendments. Most of those aren't specific antimicrobials, but they change the pH or try and dry the litter out, which then helps to reduce the growth of pathogenic microbes. Otherwise, trying to really stay on top of litter moisture is a good approach as well. It changes the water activity, reduces the water activity in the litter. And water activity is something that's been used in the food safety areas for hundreds of years. You know, that's why we used to salt meat and that sort of stuff, because it reduces the water activity. So by having dry litter, you can actually reduce the water activity in the majority of the litter to the point where you will reduce the occurrence or the growth of some of the pathogenic microbes. So good litter management is an antimicrobial, but there's no specific product that's really widely used here in Australia. Yeah, so I can share some information with you. I can hook you up around with that.
Fantastic. And yeah, look, if you are following the webinar, we do send our attendees plus anybody that has registered but wasn't able to attend links to some of the resources mentioned. So we can include that within what we send out to following the webinar. So I've not seen any other questions come through, so I will slowly move into sort of wrapping up or closing up the webinar, but there's still an opportunity if there's any sort of last burning questions that pop up, feel free to pop them in the chat if I see them come up, I will certainly put them to Mark if we receive them before the end of the webinar. So look, in closing, I would like to bring your attention to the post-webinar survey, which I think will show up on the screen shortly, or pop up on the screen, or show up once you have left the webinar. And with that, I'm just going to stop for a moment because we've had another question. Come in. Mark, we've got a question about a better way or ways to turn litter in sheds.
Unfortunately, I think the industry has led the way when it comes to litter tilling. Most other countries around the world don't do it at all. So Australian growers are really out on their own as they're doing this. I haven't seen a better technology, like there's no better litter tilling equipment than the stuff that we've got. There are people sort of working with robotic approaches so that you can hopefully send something the equivalent of a Roomba, like into your shed and do the tilling. But that hasn't really developed to the point where it's active yet. It's a challenging activity, and I tell you what, it's not something that I think growers would like to do if they don't need to. So, because it does put stress on the birds, you're taking them off food and water, and there's all the other issues with the ammonia and everything else that goes with it. So it's not necessarily preferred practice, but the idea is it's hopefully addressing some risks without introducing too many other risks by doing the practice itself. So unfortunately, if you want to get in touch with me, we can have a chat. I'd like to know what you know about it so far. And then I can share more information with you as well.
Wonderful. And I'm so sorry. My apologies to my tech support team who have been popping up the survey and removing it because I did invite questions whilst I was moving into the wrap up. So I will jump back into into the post-webinar survey. So I did see that will pop up onto screen. So it won't show up necessarily once you leave, but it will sort of remain there once you've left. Look, we greatly appreciate your time in providing any feedback, and that's just so that we can make improvements to upcoming webinars part of this series. And something that I had forgot to mention at the start was that this webinar topic was actually suggested by an industry participant. So we certainly welcome any topics that you'd like to see featured in the webinar, and we'll work with Mark to potentially do a complementary topic presented by Mark, focusing on litter management considerations for the cooler months. So this may be something in about 5 or 6 months' time. So just a couple of quick reminders or reiterations. Look, we will provide links to the resources mentioned during the webinar. There'll also be a link to the recording of the webinar. So if you are able to attend, but other colleagues or people in the industry that are interested that would like to view the recording, that will be made available. And as always, look, please remember to report anything unusual or concerns about potentially emergency animal diseases to the EAD hotline. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Mark as our sole presenter for today. Look, we're thankful for the generosity in sharing all your knowledge, and appreciate your time working with us to prepare and present today's content. And of course, thank you to everybody who's registered and joined. To anybody that's registered but wasn't able to join, we will reach you via the post webinar emails. And so with that, look, have a fantastic rest of your Thursday, and we shall see you on the next webinar part of our series. Bye for now.